This is a little series that I was assigned at an adult, they called it an adult rally in Louisiana a few weeks ago. And it challenged me, and I think it'll challenge you as well. Faithfully facing failure. We talk a lot about facing failures, and most of us, and with the new CR program that you've established here, no doubt that's a part of it, that you spend a great deal of time confessing to one another, hey, I'm a failure. I struggle here, I struggle there, and I'm constantly falling on my face here. Appreciated the reading, and frankly, I related almost all of it, and so I probably should be coming down here, although it takes me about an hour and a half to get here. But we need a CR program in program in Paragould that I could go to, and I'm sure that they exist. We all are failures. It's important for us to see ourselves as failures, because you can't really see the success of the cross unless you get to the point where you recognize you need the cross. And so I greatly appreciate this congregation. One of the reasons that I packed all my kids down here this morning is because I wanted them. I said, this is a neat congregation. You're going to like this. And I wanted them to be a part of y'all. And I wanted them to see what you're doing here, because as missionaries to America, it's very important that we take our religion and make it practical. A lot of us are religious, but not very practical in our religious pursuits of things. Religion is largely man's attempt to reach out to God, and that's a good thing. But it's not very practical at times. And sometimes, Brother David, it's just like you said, because we fall into the trap of trying to assign certain time slots. And if we could just have it all mapped out for us, if we all could be on schedule, we could start at a certain time, we could end at a certain time, and we could check it all off. And at the end of the day, we could say, looky there, I'm a success. But really and truly, life isn't that way, is it? Things are thrown at you in the middle that you didn't expect. Opportunities come that you perhaps weren't even ready for, at least you don't think that you're ready for. And so we have to respond as life gives it to us. And I want my kids I wanted them to be a part of y'all's services this morning, because I wanted them to see a very practical congregation. I brag about you everywhere I go. And I love and appreciate Remmel very, very much. Again, this is a series, and if I'm allowed to come back, we'll do number 2, and if I'm allowed to come back after that, we'll do number 3. There's 3 of them. But this idea of faithfully facing your failures, how do we do that? I thought we would open up with the very first failure. And so if you've got your Bibles and you want to open them to Genesis chapter 3, we'll be there, and we'll actually start off with a little bit in the last part of chapter 2. But let me tell you a story about one of my failures. It's nothing all that dramatic, but I grew up in Clearfield, Pennsylvania, and I went to a very large public school. We had 2 gymnasiums, a swimming pool, a large complex for our sports programs. We even had a planetarium in the high school. It was a very, very large place, and I enjoyed it and actually thrived. I played baseball and basketball, even wrestled a little bit, football, etc., and I enjoyed being a part of that. But my father always wanted me to go to Harding University. And so about my sophomore year, he drew a circle, a 100-mile radius around Searcy, Arkansas, and he said he was going to start trying to get a job somewhere in that area so that the whole family could move down from Pennsylvania to Arkansas so that I could go to Harding University, which we did. My father served at the Seventh and Muller Church of Christ for several years while I was going to college. Long story short of it, we moved between my junior and senior year. And so I only had 1 year in Paragould as far as high school was concerned, and I went to the Christian Academy there, Crowley's Ridge Academy. Loved it, enjoyed it, met my wife there, and so a lot of good things came about because of that. But this story is not really one of the brighter sides. I played basketball at Crowley's Ridge Academy, was thrilled to have that opportunity, but there was one game that we were playing, and I don't remember how it all transpired, but it was one of those fouls where the buzzer has sounded, but you were fouled before the buzzer, and so you got an opportunity to shoot free throws, but there was no one else on the court because there was no need to. They couldn't pull a rebound down because the time has already expired. I was that guy. And if I hit my free throws, we would win the game. If I didn't hit my free throws, we would lose the game. So there's a lot of pressure. It's just me and the officials on the court, everybody holding their breath, hoping that Sonny Childs can go to the line and hit his free throws. I step to the free throw line, and I'm a 3-bouncer kind of a guy, and so bop, bop, bop. And then I remembered all the coaching that I had received. Tuck the elbow, and when you release, make sure you hang your wrist on the rim. All those things went through my mind. So bop, 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 tuck my elbow, and it rimmed out. But I had one more chance. If I could just sink this free throw, we could win the game. So, bop, 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 tuck the elbow, and it rimmed out. And I'm telling you, it was one of the worst moments in my life because, the crowd, you could just hear that they were just deflated. Everybody, that kind of a thing. And of course, the opposing team, when we were at home that day, the opposing team, they rushed the floor and they're congratulating each other because they had won the game, and I'm feeling about that tall, etc. But it got worse because as I was about to leave the court, a little elderly lady came up to me, and she put her arm around my shoulder, and she said, "Son, you know the number that's on your jersey?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Years ago, my son wore that same jersey number, and he was a good free throw shooter," she said. The thing about failure is that it's embarrassing, it's awkward, it's one of those things you want to deny, it's one of those moments that you wish you could just circumvent. And in hindsight, probably most of us would do that, but we don't get that privilege, do we? You don't know what you're going to do this afternoon, and you're probably going to fail this afternoon, knowing your nature and knowing my nature. And so if you had the opportunity and you knew what was going to happen at 2:30 this afternoon, I'm going to hit that failure, and it's going to be awkward, and it's going to be embarrassing, you probably would skip 2:30 this afternoon, wouldn't you? I would, but we don't have that as an option, do we? And so I would like to suggest that the best thing for us to do with regards to failure is learn how to deal with it. I'm not suggesting that you should just accept the fact that I'm going to be a failure and so let's just go fail. But I am suggesting the fact that we as people from this very passage on have been folks who are destined to fall on our face because we live in a broken world. I don't think that we are individuals who are designed by God to be failures. When he created us, remember, we don't just get good, we get very good. That's us. But because he created us in his image, we have the ability to be creative. Think about that. Part of the essential nature of God is that he is creative. And in the process of being created, there has to be freedom to exercise your own will. But within that, there often comes failure. And so as you look at this passage, what I'd like for you to see in Genesis chapter 3 specifically, these three things. Don't hide, don't justify, and don't blame. Because these are three things that are going to defeat any processing and going through the darkness of the valley of failure and coming out the other side. If you do these three things, you're likely to linger in the valley way too long, and it might very well kill you. So don't do these three things. This is the very first, the opening failure of humanity. Avoid these things. But before we go there, I would like to share something with you from the previous chapter, because as you know, the chapter breaks are not inspired by God. And when you see the entire flow here, something I think becomes very, very important for us to recognize. If you go all the way back and notice verse 22 in chapter 2, it says this, "Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of man, and he brought her to the man." Have you ever thought about that passage and what took place that day? Kind of put yourself in that situation. So God takes a rib from man. We'll deal with that in just a moment. He takes a rib from man and he makes a woman, and then he presents the woman to the man. Now I don't want to get crazy here, but I want you to think about the first time Adam sees Eve. You don't think his eyes just popped? Like, whoa, really? For me? He's just, that it was one of those moments where it was just like overwhelming. In fact, we only get one reaction from Adam, and it's not really probably what we would like, because we'd like to have all the insights of what's going through your brain and all that kind of thing. But this is the reaction we get from Adam, verse 23. "The man said, 'This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She should be called woman, for she was taken out of man.'" That's his reaction. And to the ladies in the audience, understand this, because we happen to be programmed this way by God. We tend to be conquerors. And we tend to want to lay claim to things. And I know it's not very romantic, but that's what Adam does here. His eyes are popping out like, "For me?" And then he's going to lay claim to her, and he's going to say, "Now this is bone of my bones. This is flesh of my flesh." And he's going to say, "This is mine," because that's what men do. But understanding that, I'd like for you to appreciate something before we get into this failure mode. I'd like for you to appreciate something about the male-female relationship in the creative sphere. I believe this to be true. I think that God, when placing his image within humanity, he divided it up. And I'm not sure you can get a full picture of God unless you consider both genders. If you'll study the Old Testament, and I encourage you to do, you'll find that there are several times in the Old Testament that God is actually referred to with feminine qualities. I'm not suggesting that God is a man. I do oppose those translations that are trying to take genders away from him. I'm not that kind of a person, but I am saying this. The wholeness of God is not just found in the male gender. I believe that the wholeness of God is actually found when the male gender and the female gender come together. That's why our culture is so much in trouble. We are denying the genders. We're denying the roles of the genders. And in so doing, we really deny the full-color glossy illustration of who God is. You can't appreciate God fully if you don't understand his nurturing nature. And who better to give us that than a woman? On the other hand, you can't appreciate God fully if you don't appreciate his protective nature. And who better to provide that than a man? I believe that when he says here, verse 24, for this reason, a man will leave his mother and father, be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. I think what he was doing is setting us up to see the full wholeness of God in the male-female relationship. Now, that said, and that's all warm and fuzzy, and we like that. But now we enter into chapter 3, and we see problems. In chapter 3, if you wanted to begin reading, and we're not going to with the first verse, but if you wanted to read, where the serpent comes, we've got the whole temptation scenario that takes place. We know that Eve takes of the fruit because she sees that it's pleasant to the eyes and gaining wisdom as was promised by the serpent. She wants this. And she, of course, she gives it to her husband, and so they both fail. I'm going to be a little bit hard on men because it's interesting that what takes place here in just a moment is that God is going to call out to his creation. Where are you? And it's not like God doesn't know where they're at, but he expects for a response from those who he's created. But he doesn't call for the woman. It's interesting. We'll see that in just a moment. He calls for the man. We like to place the blame at Eve's feet, and she's going to be responsible for a lot. In fact, if you read the rest of chapter 3, you find out that there are the curses that are assigned, and women, pain in childbearing, etc., there's the curse. But there's also a curse for men. They're going to have trouble growing crops, etc. We know those two curses, and we're not going to deal with them this morning, except to say this. But if you watch this thing play out, the man who's created first is also the one who's called into being responsible in this situation, which is, I think, a very important application to be made. I want you, though, to see our first point, verses 8 through 10. The first thing that we must not do when we sin, the first thing that we must not do when we fail, is try to hide from it, or try to hide it from those who can best help us to survive it. Watch verses 8 through 10. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord called to the man, watch it, did you see that? The Lord called to the man, where are you? He answered, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. First thing that we so often do, and it really is kind of ridiculous, is it not? You think there's a bush thick enough that can hide you from God? That's what they're doing. They hear God walking in the garden. Let's find us a bush. And so they're scrambling around, seeing if they can find them some place to hide, maybe behind that tree, whatever it is. So they're hiding themselves. When God created that bush or that tree or whatever it is that they think is the barrier between them and him, you're alone. Maybe you're on a trip by yourself in a motel room, or you're home alone sitting in the living room. Your wife has gone on to bed, or your husband's gone on to bed, whatever. You're just on the internet checking your emails, all those kind of things. And there comes that pop-up. And if you're a guy, I can't speak for women, I've never been one, but if you're a guy, it's hard. I mean, and they're so tantalizing, they're so tempting. They do such a great job of drawing your attention. I just got to see. If I just one click, Lord, I just want just one click, and once I've satisfied my curiosity, I promise I won't click again. But you know what happens when you click once? All of us in the room, I suspect have had that problem. I certainly have. But the thing that's ridiculous is to think that if I'm in the darkness of the room, all you have is the glow of the monitor. I mean, my family, they're either not even with me in the motel or they're several rooms away. Nobody knows. It's just a private thing. It's not private. There's no bush thick enough to hide you from God. And there's no darkness dense enough to hide you from God. He's there. He sees every text message that you send. Every time you come to a new site on the internet, God is over your shoulder. He knows, He sees, He's there. And it is ridiculous, just like you find it ridiculous in this passage, for Adam and Eve to think that they could somehow find a part of the garden where they could go where God wouldn't be. It's ridiculous for you and I to feel that way as well. So what's the application? Well, you do it so phenomenally here, both with the John 3:17 ministry and the CR program that you got going. I mean, let's be honest, folks. I got problems. You got problems. We got problems. But that's the church. The word ecclesia, called out, obviously implies we got history. Called out of what? Well, a lot of things, but whatever it is, I'm not supposed to be there no more. And yet, folks, you just don't break those ties overnight. It's not like I can say that, okay, I got dunked in water, now I no longer have temptation. Ridiculous. If ever there was a time that Satan wants to double his efforts, it's now. He wants you back. Because think about that. If he can pull one of God's people back into the world, that's a double credit to his evil scheme and evil ways. He really wants us now. And so he heightens the temptations, etc. Don't hide. Be a part. I appreciate the advertisement that we have for the CR program because I think it's so true. Forgive my English, but there ain't a one of us in the room who couldn't benefit from that. Accountability to one another. Don't hide. Secondly, don't justify. If you continue reading verse 10 and 11, these two verses are interesting to me. He says, he answered Adam, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. And he said, who told you that you're naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? You can't reason with God and be successful. It's not like you can argue with God and somehow win the point. Job proved that, did he not? Remember that whole book of Job? I love the book of Job. I relate to it so often because Job is one of those who's trying to process it, trying to figure out, trying to justify. This just doesn't make sense, Lord. I've been trying to be a good boy down here, and now I got all these problems. This just does not make sense. And you know, the entire book of Job, God gives not a single answer. The only thing, when Job finally breaks through and God feels like, okay, I better say something, he doesn't answer. He just gives more questions. Where were you when I hung the stars in the sky? Where were you? And he gives that long list of where were you? It's not really an answer, and yet it is. It's simply this. You haven't the ability to enter into my courtroom and argue your own case. And yet, do you find it not interesting what Adam does here? This just shows you how weak we are as humans. First thing out of his mouth was, I was naked, so I hid myself. Boom! He's already convicted himself just by opening his mouth. And so God says, hold on. How do you know you're naked? Where'd you get that information? See, boom! Just by opening his mouth, he convicts himself. You can't justify it away. So don't hide. And don't try to do what I so often do. Go through the processes. What could I do to make this kind of sort of sound look maybe a little bit right? Now, you're a failure. You messed up. Don't hide it. And don't try to reason it away. God was already in your heart before you did whatever you done did. So just let him have it. And when you're a part of a group like you are here, it is so much a blessing to recognize that there's other folks in the room who've been there before I was. So why try to process through it? Why try to sugarcoat it? Let's just be honest. Number 3. There is always the blame game. And of course, Adam enters into this blame game, as you've seen before in other sermons, I'm sure. Notice verse 12. It's the man who says, obviously, because he's going to blame the woman, but it's the man who says, the woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it. It's not just the woman, but some preachers have made points about this, and they're probably accurate, but he does indicate it's the woman, by the way, God, you gave me. You know, the one you put here? That's where the mess up is. You see how he's passing it off? It's a woman's fault. And if it's not her fault, well, it's certainly your fault because you gave me the woman. Why is it so hard? And I don't know the answer to this one, but it is certainly me. Why is it so hard to just say, I am the man. I did it. Now, next time we get a chance to do this, we'll look at David. Nathan comes in. How would you like to be the prophet Nathan, who is given the assignment, you got to go talk to the king and tell him he's a murderer, he's an adulterer, he's a mess up, and if you read the context, we'll see it whenever I get to come back, he actually says, you have caused God to be shamed before his enemies. Now, Nathan has to go in because remember who the king is. King's the guy who can say, take his head off, I don't like what he's saying. Nathan gets that assignment. And remember he tells that little story about the lamb? And boy, he's enraged by this, because if there's one thing David could relate to, it was little lambs. And David says, you tell me who it was that's guilty of that, and I'm telling you, he will not live. Nathan points in David's direction. He says, you are the man. God knows that. There's no mystery. So, don't blame. Just understand your guilt and give it to God. I preached some weeks ago when I was here out of the book of Luke, chapter 22. I just want you, there's just one little verse there, and you don't even have to go there if you don't want to. I'm going to read it to you. In Luke chapter 22, it's the story about Peter, and Peter's denying his Lord. And we're always really hard on Peter, and rightfully so. I mean, he was the one who's always popping off. He's the guy who's always got something to say, and very flamboyant, it seems, in the way that he went through life, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a lot of blame for Peter to have in this. But I want to remind you on this cold night, all of the Lord's people have scattered to the four winds. Jesus is very much, it seems, alone in that heavy pressing crowd who wants to crucify him. Who's the only one close by enough to at least catch his eye across the courtyard? I know Peter had problems, but isn't that us? I mean, I can so relate to this guy. I am forever popping off when I should have kept my mouth shut. I'm forever jumping without thinking. That's me. I can relate to Peter. It says here in verse 61, Peter replied to the man who asked him, do you know this Jesus? He said, I don't know what you're talking about. Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. Verse 61, the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you'll disown me 3 times. And he went outside and he wept bitterly. I want you to stop, and in your mind's eye, I want you to try to capture that. You, just a little while ago, had a sword in your hand and was trying to cut the guy's head off, and you missed. But you were hacking, and you cut the guy's ear off in the garden, trying to defend your Jesus. Jesus says, put the sword up. This all has to happen. And you're a little bit, really? I mean, I want to do something. I want to act. I want to hit somebody. They can't take you away, Jesus. But you see Jesus as he's going down the trail. And you follow. It's at a distance, I get that, but you're following. And you go right into the courtyard, and you can see what's happening, and you can probably hear a lot of what's taking place, and you know some of those charges are not accurate. You know that's not right. You know they're lying. But you're asked several times, you know the guy on trial? Fear for your own safety. Confusion swirling all around you. You're just not sure what to do in this situation. It's not supposed to go down this way. And you deny him repeatedly. But you're in the court. You're in the area. You're close enough to see him. Surely that counts for something, and hear me, it does. To those of you who are mature in this room, and I'm trying to get there, but to those of you who are mature in this room, hear me. It is a good thing to catch the eye of the Lord, even when you've messed up. It is a good thing to look Jesus eye to eye, even though you see a tear in his. It is necessary to survive failure. You must look into the eyes of perfection. And when you do, it will hurt. You'll feel guilt. You'll want to slink away into the darkness. You'll want to withdraw. You'll want to deny it. All of those things will rage inside of you. But if you can keep the eye of the Lord. You see, both Peter and Judas did essentially the same thing. Judas does not give his Lord the opportunity, but Peter does. Peter goes on to be one of the most prolific preachers of the first century. Why? Because he caught the eye of the Lord, and it broke him. He goes out and he weeps bitterly. But he does not walk away from his Jesus. Failure is bound to happen. But Jesus, catching his eye, being convicted by what you see. I know I've told you this story before, but pretend like I didn't. I'll end with this. Little boy walking down the sidewalk sees a sign in the window. It says puppies for sale. He just has to have a puppy. He just knows he has to have a puppy. He walks to the door. The man's dealing with puppies, and he doesn't hear the kid come in, but the kid walks all the way up to the counter before the man recognizes that there's somebody in the store, and he turns and he looks, and the little guy's so short, you can only see his eyes above the counter. It's kind of like this, but you can see excitement, and the man said, "Son, can I help you?" And he said, "Sir, is it true? Is it true? Is the sign on the window, is it really true? Do you have puppies for sale?" And the man said, well, yeah, I do. He reached into his breeches and he pulled out a dime and 2 pennies. He said, "Sir, I have been saving this money. Do you think that's enough for me to get a puppy?" Well, the man could tell this little guy needed a puppy. And it cost a whole lot more than that to get a puppy in that store, but he needed a puppy. He said, "Son, you're not going to believe it. We're running a special right now. And you got just enough." He said, "Look at all these puppies." And there were all kinds of pens back here behind, and they were all squeaking little puppies back here. He said, "Listen, you choose whatever puppy you want, and it's yours." The little guy, he took a little time because he couldn't hardly see over the counter and all that, so he looked in, and finally he found the one he wanted. He said, "Sir, that one right there, that's the one I want." "Well, that's a good choice," the man said. And he went over to that cage, and there was about a dozen of them in there, so he didn't really know which one the kid was wanting, but he picked one up, and he said, "This is the one you want, huh?" He said, No, I want that one." So he went back and he got another squeaking little puppy. He said, "Is this the one you want?" "No, the one in the corner, that's the one I want." So the man went back, and then he noticed the little puppy in the corner was the runt. And the runt had a problem. When he was born, he had a deformed hip. And so he was never going to be able to run or play. And the man's thinking, what do I do? How do I explain this to the little guy? He picked the little puppy up, and he brought him back, and he held him in his hand. He said, "Son, I don't think you want this one. This one's the runt. And I don't know how to say it nicely, but the other puppies won't even play with this one. His deformed hip it won't let him run around the cage. And as he grows up, it's only going to get worse. He'll never be able to fetch the stick or anything. You don't want the runt. Let me give you one of these other healthy puppies. And so he turned to put the little puppy back, and the boy said, no, sir. I want that one. Well, it's just a runt. He's making 12 cents off of it. So he decorated that little basket up the best he could, and pushed it across the table to the little guy. Scooped the 12 cents into his hand, and he turned and went to the cash register as the little guy started to leave. He put the money in the cash register, and then he turned just as the little guy was about to go out the door, and he saw something for the first time. You see, that counter had hid the little guy. The man didn't get the full picture. But as the little guy's about to leave the building, he noticed that there was a brace running from his hip all the way down his leg, and as he walked with a limp. The only person in the pet store that day that could relate to the runt was the runt. They never chose him to play kickball. Whenever others went racing off to get a snow cone, he was always the last to arrive. It didn't seem like he had friends that wanted to be around him because he couldn't participate as easily as they could. And when he saw the runt, he said, I want that one because I can relate. Jesus came into this world to become a runt. And he can relate. He knows you're a failure. He knows what it's like to be hurt. He knows what it's like to be picked last for the team. He knows what it's like for people to talk about him, to not want him around, to push him aside. In order for your Jesus to be the perfect high priest, he had to be tempted in all points, just like us. He knows what it's like to be a runt. Yet he was without sin, thus allowing him to be a runt sacrificed for the runts. You're a failure. But if you won't hide it, you won't try to justify it, don't blame everybody else for your problems. Just take it to the Jesus who loved you enough to come into this world and literally be killed by the created. The creator killed by the created. The changes he can bring about in your life. The successes he can bring about. Because all things work together for good for those who love the Lord. And you love the Lord, or you wouldn't be here this morning. We have an invitation song. If you don't know Jesus, I beg of you, recognize that he's the only one who can really make you feel good about you. As we sing this song, if you have never given your life to Jesus, I pray that you'll respond. I'll be up here. I think there's going to be folks at the back. As we sing it, if you need to respond, please come as we stand and as we sing.